Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, Letitia James is a district attorney that is on the warpath. She is somebody who has gone after President Trump. She has gone after many people. And one of the people that, or one of the groups rather, that she has been prosecuting and persecuting is the publication VDARE. They've come under fire. She's attempted to shut them down in pretty much every way possible. And so I wanted to bring someone on to talk about what's going on, why she feels like she can get away with this, and why this is impacting our First Amendment rights. So joining me today to talk about that is a longtime writer over at VDARE, James Kirkpatrick. Thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me here. Although I wish it was under better circumstances.
Yeah, obviously it's terrible what's happening. I want to dive into all the background. Like I said, why she feels like she can get away with this, why the First Amendment doesn't seem to be holding up or protecting the right of the dare to publish what they're doing. And I also want to get into the history of paleoconservatism, because I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that paleoconservatism is a strain of conservative thought that has long been pushed out of the conservative mainstream. And the fact that it's returning with figures like Donald Trump has kind of brought this ire upon organizations like VDARE. But before we dive into that, guys, let's go ahead and hear from today's sponsor. Hey guys, I don't know about you, but I'm at the point in my life where I can't really afford to have a rough morning after hanging out and having a few drinks with the guys. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. And it's that byproduct, not just dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break down that byproduct. So just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. If I want to grab drinks with friends and make sure I'm on top of my game the next morning, I grab ZBiotics first. Vacations, weddings, birthdays, reunions. There's a lot going on this spring, so make sure to stock up on ZBiotics. You can go to zbiotics.com/Auron to get 15% off your first order when you use Auron at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So remember to head to zbiotics.com/Auron and use the promo code Auron at checkout for 15% off. All right, guys, before we dive into the story of the battle between Letitia James and VDARE, I also want to tell you about a new documentary that's coming out. The Blaze Docs team has been killing it, and I'm not just saying that because I work here. I'm also telling you that because they've done great work when it comes to the crisis at the border and the way that the Biden administration is fundamentally transforming this country and trying to basically change the electoral map for the rest of history. And now they have a new documentary talking about how politicians get filthy rich. It's called Bought and Paid For, How Politicians Get Filthy Rich. It's our own James Polis, and he teams up with the anonymous account Mysterious Whales to go ahead and explain how all of these different politicians who work in Washington, D.C., all these different congressmen are so good at investing in stocks. They expose everybody left and right. They do a great job of laying out all of the different problems. It's well worth your time to go ahead and watch. You can watch it over at Blaze TV. Of course, subscribe to Blaze TV to watch it. And if you go to Blaze TV tonight, you'll be able to watch the premiere episode with Glenn Beck and James Polis. They'll be giving you commentary before the show premieres. So go ahead and check that out now, guys. All right. So, James, for people who are just unfamiliar with VDARE and the situation there, let's just start with a little bit of background. Who is Peter Brimelow? What is VDARE? Where did it come from?
Well, Peter Brimelow was an editor at National Review. He wrote a best-selling book in the 1990s called Alien Nation, which really brought the immigration issue to the forefront. And he also wrote a cover story at National Review talking about the immigration issue. And as I think you've pointed out on a number of other occasions, he's another one of these figures who's been mocked for correctly predicting the future. Just about everything he predicted in this article, Time to Rethink Immigration, has essentially come true, most notably the fact that California is now a forever blue state. However, accurately predicting the future has never really been a path to success in the conservative movement, so he was essentially pushed out of National Review. And that's when he started VDARE.com, named for Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. This was one of the first sites that really took advantage of the internet. And it's worth remembering the way people used to speak about the internet as this, and including liberals, especially liberals, in fact, this idea that open communication and free speech, and this was all going to lead to the way democracy is truly supposed to work and a truly informed citizenry. And for some time, it did seem to operate that way. And VDARE had a big impact, despite essentially being frozen out by the conservative movement. It's published a number of major writers over the years, some of whom have now broken into the mainstream or the near mainstream. Steve Saylor, for example, his books were published by VDARE.com. Unfortunately for Peter and for his wife Lydia, it seems that they've triumphed, and the price of their triumph was their professional destruction, because immigration was always a tough battle within the GOP. You have to remember the Wall Street Journal used to advocate for a constitutional amendment that said there shall be open borders. That was considered to be the establishment GOP position. Now there's really nobody pushing for more immigration, at least not openly, within the GOP. The Trump revolution really has reshaped the GOP, but that also means that they're a bigger target. And so now Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, the same one who went after the NRA, the same one who was going after President Trump, basically put VDARE.com in the cross sites. And now after 25 years, it looks like that's it for this online publication, which really was an important part of not just conservative history, but internet history. And I think the attack on it really shows how the norm of free speech, which I think we once considered to be fundamental to the American identity, has been completely wiped out with very little resistance.
Yeah, it really is wild how things have changed. Like you said, Peter Brimlow and many others, Pat Buchanan, were really out in front of this a very long time ago. And Donald Trump's kind of picked up that banner in a very important way and shifted that conversation. I played the clip of Bernie Sanders talking about how open borders was a Koch brothers conspiracy. And he was right about that, by the way, at the time.
100%. And again, that's why the Wall Street Journal was campaigning for open borders for so long. I mean, keep in mind and this is true of everybody you just discussed, Peter Brimlow, libertarian journalist, worked with all the new Rupert Murdoch, worked with all these establishment conservative people. Pat Buchanan was in the Reagan administration, and he was sort of the administration's liaison to the conservative groups, famously an aide to Richard Nixon. And then, of course, Donald Trump, who was a beloved real estate investor, TV celebrity, up until the point he started running for president and came down that escalator, at which point all the people who had worked with him his whole life decided they hated him and that he was a racist all along. In all of these cases, we see that the people who have achieved success within the system, it really can be taken away very quickly once you step on the wrong side of a lot of these issues. And the biggest issue fundamentally is immigration, because immigration determines everything else. Demography is destiny, for better or worse. And if you don't get immigration right, nothing else really matters. And that's really been VDARE's message since the beginning.
Yeah, this is something that I've tried to explain so often to people. I care about a whole bunch of issues. I'm not a single issue person. I understand that there are many critical things that we need to be able to focus on. But you're right that immigration is pretty much the linchpin, because in a democracy, whether we like it or not, that is the reality of the kind of system that we live in. In a democracy, you are going to have the way that your decisions are made impacted by the people who cast the votes. And if you can fundamentally change the people who are in the country, which many people on the left and sadly even on the right seem more than happy to do, then you will change the way that they vote. The left is not squeamish about saying this. In fact, they brag about it all the time. As soon as we can transform Texas, as soon as we can transform some of these other states, we to Latino or something else, we can switch it over. They announce these plans on a regular basis. They act shocked and surprised if someone notices, right? It's the celebration parallax. They're allowed to brag about it, but if you notice and say maybe that's not a great thing, all of a sudden it's a terrible problem. But you're absolutely right that this has shifted so dramatically over the years, and I think that's why we're seeing the crackdowns on free speech that you're talking about. You simply cannot let this kind of stuff come back into the popular consciousness. You can't let people understand the kind of issues that this creates, because they might realize that their country is slowly and surely being changed underneath them. And so I wonder if you could get
being
a little
done deliberately, which is the key.
Of course, and again, the left will tell you that
Right.
they're not. There's no hesitation on that unless Tucker Carlson says it, and then all of a
Right. Then
sudden,
it's a problem.
exactly. And so I was hoping you could go ahead and lay out again for people who are not familiar what Letitia James is actually doing. What is her excuse for trying to shut down VDARE? What kind of leverage is she bringing legally, and why is that making it impossible for the site to operate?
Well, to set the stage, we have to go back a couple of years and kind of shows how this whole thing works with the restriction of free speech. VDARE.com was trying to host conferences for several years between 2016 and 2019, and they kept booking conferences at hotels, and then the hotel would sign a contract, and then the hotel would cancel at the last minute. Eventually, they started putting in clauses where they would have to pay a penalty if they canceled. They would still cancel anyway, which might have been amusing a little bit, but the whole point was to actually host a conference. And so VDARE decided that they needed to buy their own conference venue because you simply cannot have a conference for right-wing ideas in the United States of America at a private business. You're just not, you can't get away with that. It will be canceled. People will call in bomb threats. Antifa will swarm the venue. You have to have your own thing. So that's why they bought this castle in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. They got it actually at a remarkably cheap price because it's West Virginia. It's a property that was having a hard time finding somebody to really look after it and give it the love it deserved. And they got a big donation 1 year. So they purchased that, they started fixing it up, and that was going to be where they host these conferences. Now, Letitia James says it was the purchase of this castle which started her investigation. And you might be asking yourself, well, what does the Attorney General of New York have to do with this group operating in West Virginia? Well, in 1999, back when such things were really unimaginable, a lawyer who had passed the bar in that state set up the VDARE nonprofit. So it was still technically operating in New York. And that little thing, which again, nobody would have thought of in 1999, is really what allowed everything else to be set in motion. Now, interestingly enough, even though the whole investigation was supposedly about this deal to purchase the castle, the very first subpoenas came from the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit from New York, which had just been set up, which is supposed to look into hate crimes, which to me sort of gives the whole game away, that it had nothing to do with any of the stuff that they actually say they're talking about. It had to do with shutting this group down. Letitia James, when she was running for office, even talked about how it was a problem that there was so much hate being spread online and how she was going to do something about it. Well, now we know what that looks like. It's interesting, too, that VDARE hasn't actually been charged with anything. You might be saying, well, what exactly is the problem here? The problem is they keep issuing subpoenas to the group saying you need to turn over all of this information. This included the names of all the writers, some of whom write anonymously. This includes all of the email communications. This includes various things about business relationships and vendors, all of which has a tendency to be leaked. As a matter of fact, it was actually Letitia James's office that leaked a number of Nikki Haley's donors. I suppose that was just a random accident. But if you're working for a website where it could be the end of your career, if you're a Border Patrol agent or an insider in government writing for the site, it's kind of a big deal if your name is going to get leaked or not. The bigger thing, of course, is that these subpoenas are extraordinarily expensive. VDARE is not a huge group. Up to this point, they've spent about $800,000 just fulfilling all these legal requirements. That's basically the entire yearly budget, and that's a yearly budget on a good year. Nothing has actually been charged. Nobody has actually filed anything. And you may say to yourself, well, in the United States of America, the government can't just keep subpoenaing you forever until you run out of money and then shut you down. And it's like, well, yeah, actually, that is how the government works now. They can just subpoena you forever. They can just keep doing that until you're out of money and then you close. And that's just how the system works now. And that's essentially what happened to VDARE.com. Now, they tried to fight it, of course. At first, they did a good faith effort to meet these subpoenas, extraordinarily expensive as they were. They repeatedly tried to meet with Letitia James and discuss the castle deal and whatever else she wanted to know. She refused to meet with them. She just kept issuing more subpoenas. They filed for relief in federal court. The federal court booted it because in an extraordinary act, Letitia James actually refiled something in state court. And then the federal court said, well, the state court is dealing with this, so we're not going to touch it, which by itself was pretty extraordinary. Obviously, if you're dealing with New York State Court, the people who are dealing with these cases are elected Democrats. Now, you have to ask yourself, if you're trying to move up in the world in the New York political system, why are you going to side with VDARE.com on anything, regardless of what the law is? We are working in the realm of politics, and the idea that there's a separation between the law and politics, I think, is an illusion that really needs to die. Peter has said that a lot of this is sort of like being in a nightmare because no matter what you do, the circumstances keep changing. Letitia James's office put forward different justifications for the information they were asking for when they filed in federal court, where they said they didn't want to know about the names of all these people, and in the state court, where they admitted that actually, yes, we do want to know the names of all these people. In theory, that's against the law. In theory, you're not allowed to do that. In practice, it simply doesn't matter. And you're also fighting against something that has unlimited resources. VDARE.com on the surface is a pretty marginal group in terms of its budget, in terms of its clout within Congress, say. It's not something that really is talked about as a power broker, and yet you see this extraordinary investment of money and time from someone who clearly has her eye on higher office. And you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? Part of it may be because VDARE.com has grown in prominence as the immigration issue has become mainstream. But I think the larger issue is just because they can. Why wouldn't you do it? There's no actual institutional check to prevent blue state officials from acting in this way. And the heart of politics fundamentally is the friend-enemy distinction, something on the political right seems to have forgotten, but the political left has not. And so if you can destroy enemies, if you can take their money, if you can just make it that little bit harder for them to get things done, why wouldn't you do that? And we've seen it because this is the same person who went after the NRA. And of course, most famously, this is the same person who went after Donald Trump in a real estate case that a number of business professionals in New York City considered to be utterly horrifying because Trump was penalized for doing the sorts of things that just about every real estate professional does.
Yeah, and she's been, again, very clear about her intentions. I'm going to go punish Donald Trump, and obviously...
She said this when she was running.
Right.
I mean, you have to take a step back and really... I'd like to ask your audience to just really think about this for a second. When the chief law enforcement officer of the state says, I am running for office because I am going to destroy this political enemy, and the people vote for them for that reason, what exactly is going to be the check on such behavior? What written laws, what constitutions, what elected judges who are appointed by these same liberals or run for office as these same liberals, how exactly do you stop that? And I think that this is something that the right needs to really come to terms with, because we have this assumption that the system can sort of defend itself or that the law somehow works out. The rule of law is a social convention. And if one side just abandons that social convention, the rule of law itself goes away.
And I think one of the key things to keep anybody from kind of lining up behind and defending what's going on here is this Alex Jones effect. I want to talk about that because it's very clear, I think, that VDARE is a canary in a coal mine, much in the way that Alex Jones was when it came to internet censorship. But before we dive into that, guys, let's talk a little bit about your moral duty to hire based people through New Founding. Hey guys, I need to talk to you about New Founding. Look, we all know that the job market is a disaster right now. Based people can't find good companies to work for, and good companies can't find employees to get the work done. And that's why you need access to the New Founding Network. New Founding has created a network of high excellence professionals who are seeking to join grounded American businesses. They're individuals, often in elite organizations, who are ready for a team and mission that supports their values instead of working against them. Aligned companies are already using the network to hire high trust, exceptional individuals who match the culture and mission of their team. You can apply for access to the New Founding Talent Network at newfounding.com/talent. You'll be connected with candidates who will build your business. That's newfounding.com/talent. Go there now to find your next hire. So you would assume that if you have a rogue attorney general going after a outlet, any outlet, right? In any place where journalism is occurring, that would be a huge issue if you
You
had
would think. You would
if
think.
you had, the Attorney General of Florida shutting down every leftist
That'd be the end of the
paper.
world. It'd be the
Right.
end of the world.
Yeah, it would be absolutely insane. And so that would be the biggest story everywhere. Now, of course, no one here, we don't need to put on airs.
Yeah,
None of us are
certainly not.
surprised
No,
that
no.
the left are not coming to the defense of the First Amendment here. No shock there. But you would think that the right would have learned a lesson, because we saw what happened to Alex Jones, right? You can feel
Right.
however you like about Alex Jones and the veracity of what he says. But obviously his cancellation, the way that multiple platforms simultaneously colluded to shut him down and shut him off and silence him, was the very beginning of a large amount of internet censorship that hit everybody,
Right.
not just the out there people, not just the people wearing tinfoil hats, not just the people saying naughty things you're not allowed to say, but even basic mainstream conservatives lost the
Mhm.
ability to say very important things, very important truths online. And Alex Jones was the first domino in that. And you kind of wonder, if people had gone to the woodshed for Alex Jones, would we have seen everything that we saw? Would the 2020 election have gone entirely differently if the right had had the courage of its
Yeah.
convictions to stand up? And now you look at what's happening to VDARE, and are you guys getting lots of support from the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, all these right-wing
Oh, certainly
outlets?
not.
No,
Certainly
of
not.
course.
And what's remarkable about this is Peter Brimlow is not exactly a marginal character. I mean, this is somebody who worked in the conservative movement for decades, knows everybody. And a number of prominent people have obviously written for the site over the years. Steve Seller, as I talked about, but John Derbyshire from the National Review, Ian Coulter, Michelle Malkin. I mean, you name it, we've had them in our pages at some point. And I mean, I'm pretty small fry compared to most of the writers at this. And yet you really haven't seen a lot of outlets speaking up. I think the American Conservative said something, Revolver may have said something, a couple people have tweeted some stuff here and there, but you're not really seeing the conservative movement, certainly not National Review, coming out and defending this outlet. And I think when you think about like how we ended up here, it's not just, oh, you can't host a conference. You have to consider what VDARE has been through. And this is, I don't want to say VDARE is the only group that's had to deal with this. Just about everybody has. They've been canceled from Constant Contact, Google AdSense, Amazon, credit card processors. I mean, the cruelest blow has to be the credit card processors, which came just a couple weeks ago, where they were trying to raise money for sort of a last-ditch legal defense. And the banks were no longer willing to support, I believe it was GabPro, because after Stripe canceled them, you have to go with somebody else. The banks were no longer able to provide such services. And there's good reason to believe that federal regulators are the ones pressuring these banks to say, hey, you can't provide credit card processing services to these specific companies that we're looking at. That is where we're at. It's not just that all these private companies deny you services. It's also that the hidden hand of the state is there, making sure you are financially deplatformed. And then if that fails, if you still are able to operate, then they just try to shut you down directly. And it's not just VDARE, it's not just Alex Jones, it's a host of people. And it's been going on for a very long time, really since 2016, certainly picked up speed in 2017. And I would call it the biggest cultural revolution of my lifetime, bigger than transgenderism, bigger than anything else people can point to, because even in 2015, it would have been taken absolutely for granted by just about everybody that even if you disagree with what somebody says, they have the right to say it, especially on the internet. You have the right to read whatever you want. And if there's certain information you want, you have the right to find it. Now, every single government in the West takes it absolutely for granted that they need to censor information in the name of protecting democracy. And while the United States still protects that right legally, de facto, that right really doesn't exist anymore because they've made it just about impossible to operate.
Yeah, you can really tell that the pretense is gone. I remember
Mm-hmm.
my entire life, people would defend places like the ACLU, saying, look, at the end of the day, they defended the right of the Klan to march, right? Like that, it
Right.
doesn't matter,
Right.
no matter how vile the speech is, this is the United States, and you have the right to go ahead and do that. And the organizations that are ostensibly dedicated to the protection of civil liberties are going to stand behind you no matter what. We always understand that even if we don't agree with what someone is about to put out, it's critical that they be allowed to voice that opinion. And people can take a look at your writing or others and decide for themselves if they feel like, they agree with it. But they have to be able to see that first,
Right.
right? Like that's the most basic right that you have, is the ability to put that kind of stuff out. And
And
again,
It's
You
fundamental to democracy, because what is the justification for democracy if people can't debate ideas? How are the people supposed to decide anything?
Again, yeah, and you would think that the right would have learned this lesson, because if they're going to come for you guys, if they're going to come at the margins like this, they're obviously not going to stop there. It feels like the same delusion where people thought, oh, well, if we just swap like Ron DeSantis in for Trump, then they'll just treat him really nice,
Right,
right?
right,
Because
right.
the real problem is Trump. It's like, no, the problem is they've weaponized the entire system, and the Constitution doesn't mean anything because everyone involved has lost the spirit of it, and they're just looking for ways to get around and go ahead and punish their enemies anyway.
Right. And VDARE, I would say, is probably, I mean, this is the irony of the whole situation. It's less marginal now, probably, than it's ever been, and it has less freedom to operate than it's ever had. The issues that we talk about have gone absolutely mainstream, arguably have taken over the entire GOP, taken over the entire conservative movement. And yet, it's at this moment you get shut down. And it's at this moment when the conservative movement is largely silent. And this gets to your point about the fact that there hasn't been much pushback. I mean, one of the tragic ironies of this whole deplatforming push over the last decade or so is that if you're on the right, if somebody to your right or somebody you perceive as being to your right gets taken out, in terms of material interest, that's probably a good thing for you. It removes the competition. It means greater market share. And so there's always kind of a concrete interest in keeping silent, not saying anything, hoping that they won't come for you next. And you certainly see this game with a lot of people on the right where they don't defend certain targets, especially if they are afraid that that'll bring the eye of Sauron on them too. But I think there's also a more cynical explanation, which is that the more people who get taken out, the more you can tell yourself that if you play it safe, you'll be able to capture the market. That may be good if you're trying to make a living in this, but if we're trying to win, if we're trying to save the country, if we're trying to defend the kind of liberties that every other generation of Americans could have taken for granted, this isn't a way to go about doing anything.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's even worse than that. I think a lot of them recognize that many of the, much in the mainstream conservative movement has seen some pretty significant failures, and that's become very obvious to their base. And all of a sudden, there's pressure from their right for the first time, I think, in a very long time, to make changes, and they're all very
Right.
scared. We see a lot of mainstream people panicking
Oh,
over
yeah.
the issues that are being addressed and who's addressing them. And so I think that they recognize that they can use the pressure of the left, if
Yeah.
only by their very silence, to go ahead and get rid of that threat to their voice. And so
Yeah.
why would they stick their neck out for the rights of people who are honestly holding their feet to the fire and offering an alternative to what's kind of been the containment of right-wing opinion in the United States, when they can just kind of let the left do what they're going to do and say, oh, well, I don't want to touch this, it's too spicy for me.
Yeah, I mean, as a lot of people have pointed out, conservatives reach out to their left and cancel to their right, whereas the left operates the opposite way. You never see the left go after its own quote unquote extremes. They understand that those people kind of pave the way for what they're trying to do later. Certainly, if a conservative group exposed, say, somebody in the Biden administration for having been a communist, do you think anyone would care? Do you think a single, like, quote unquote mainstream media outlet would even run a story on it? No. It would just stay in the right wing echo chamber, and that's why they win. It does lead to a difficult conversation for a lot of the people on our side. And this is where I really want to ask the audience to take this to heart. We really do have to have a principled defense of free speech for everyone on our side, especially, but everyone in general, especially the people we don't agree with, because the left has completely abandoned this at this point. So this principle is still there. And if you look at the polls, a majority of the American people still believe in it, as a principle. This weapon is there waiting to be picked up, and we can hold it. But that also means we have to be willing to tolerate a certain chaos. We have to be willing to tolerate certain arguments on our side that might make us uncomfortable. But we have to be willing to go through this, because the situation for our country has grown so desperate that operating as this kind of controlled opposition really hasn't gotten us anywhere. And I, for one, am not content to simply try to make a living within the conservative movement. If that was my goal, I think if that was your goal, there are easier ways to make a living and there are easier ways to make money. We're not in it for that. We're in it to save the country. And if we're going to save the country, we have to make sure it's worth saving. And that means fighting for the First Amendment, not just as some abstract legal principle, but as something we can really use in the real world.
So I think, like you said, a big part of this is that VDARE has seen the increase in its own relevance in
Hmm.
current years. It's been fighting in these trenches for a long time, but these issues have now become central. And like I said, I think a big part of that is the return of many paleoconservative ideas. Now, as the name kind of probably shows most people, that's not a new thing. Paleoconservatives
No.
have been around for a while, and they've had their moments. Obviously, again, Pat Buchanan and others have risen to prominence at certain times and had large platforms. But it's always been something that has pushed back under in many situations. I believe I read somewhere, so someone explained basically guys like Pat Buchanan were along for the ride with the neoconservatives back when the Soviet Union was a big deal, right? When Russia really
Right.
was an existential threat, you really did have to worry about the way of life that was, that was being threatened there. And so they kind of went along with this as long as there was a larger enemy that they had to kind of align themselves against. But once this was gone, and then it became clear that America was going to come up with new and different ways that it
Right.
needed to invade foreign countries and invite other countries into the United States, it became clear that something else was at play. We weren't just defeating the Soviet Union anymore. We were launching, I think, a wider empire, and that scared many people. Could you talk about the beginnings of maybe some key figures in the paleoconservative space that people might be familiar with or might need to learn about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the paleoconservative, neoconservative divide may seem like a lot of inside baseball regarding the conservative movement, but it's important because these are the battles over jobs and positions and who gets to set the line for the American right. And that kind of determines everything that is to follow. There were some major battles between neoconservatives and paleoconservatives during the Reagan administration and later, and the neoconservatives largely won. And that's why American policy took the direction it did under the Bush administrations. And then going forward up until now, really up until Donald Trump, there were a lot of issues like non-interventionism, trade policy, immigration, a lot of these things that were just kind of left on the table, and things that could have been done were not done. The most famous paleoconservative is of course, Pat Buchanan, who was the conservative true believer, both under Nixon and then in the Reagan administration. And when he ran in 1992 and then in 1996, he experienced extraordinary attack from the conservative movement, not especially National Review and William F. Buckley. A lot of people perceived this as a major betrayal because Buchanan was the guy for keeping Reagan on the straight and narrow and also keeping Bush 1 on the straight and narrow. And yet they stabbed him in the back as soon as they got the chance. When Trump won, Buchanan said something along the lines of, I believe it was in Politico, the ideas made it, but I didn't. And it's unfortunate because so many of the problems that we're dealing with now, Pat Buchanan had talked about in 1992 and 1996. And if the conservative movement had come around then, we just simply wouldn't be dealing with a lot of these problems right now. There would be no immigration issue, for example. Some of the other figures who have been popular, of course, are people like Paul Gottfried, Peter Brimlow himself, of course, but also Russell Kirk, who, if you've ever worked in the conservative movement, you'll know as the author of The Conservative Mind. That was kind of like the standard intellectual conservative text. Well, people don't realize that he was basically thrown out of the conservative movement for supporting Buchanan. Along with people like Sam Francis and the libertarian Murray Rothbard, he was one of the people who was sort of the brain trust around Buchanan's first run. And one of the things that the metaphors that people have used when discussing the whole neoconservative, paleoconservative tension is that the neoconservatives were kind of the Johnny-come-latelys to the conservative movement. Most of them were liberals. And when the civil rights movement became sort of the Black Power movement later on in the late 60s and early 70s, that's when they sort of broke with the left. But they were still fundamentally liberals. They were just liberals who liked using military force against the Soviet Union. And they were sort of welcomed into the conservative movement, but they were never really part of the group. They never really aligned with everybody else, and they were never really part of the grassroots. And as one person said, it might have been Kirk himself, everybody rejoices when a prostitute sees the error of her ways and comes to church, but that doesn't mean you want her speaking from the pulpit. And that's essentially what's happened, where you had the conservative movement hijacked by people who were never really part of it, and who not only took the movement in a direction that was highly unfortunate, but started kicking out the people who had actually built the thing. I would actually consider one of the people who I had the honor to know at the end of her life and was a big supporter of Trump in 2016, somebody who I think is the most effective grassroots conservative of all time, but I would definitely call it paleoconservatives, which was the late Phyllis Schlafly. There would be no conservative movement without Phyllis Schlafly. She was one of the first activists against mass immigration, against globalism, against so-called free trade. And yet, when Eagle Forum was one of the most important grassroots conservative groups during the entire Cold War. And yet, at the end, you never saw her really welcomed or given the honor that she was due, because we were honoring people like Christopher Hitchens because he supported the Iraq War. Christopher Hitchens is an atheist who's never aligned with the right on anything, but you have National Review doing hosannas to him. I mean, there's a certain element in which there's never really been an American right, because every time it seems like the movement is coming into its own, some people who were never really part of it shove themselves to the front of the line and then send it on these tangents that don't really go anywhere. And certainly we saw that with George W. Bush, where you had massive opportunities to do a lot of productive things, most notably shut down mass immigration following 9/11. And instead, things actually got worse. And now I think the Republican base has become so sick and so bitter of these continued betrayals that they're starting to look to the people who had been kicked out of the movement a long time ago, the people who William F. Buckley and his tradition of purges said were no longer part of the respectable right. Well, the respectable right has failed us. So maybe instead of looking to the respectable right, we need to start looking to the real right if we actually want to win this thing.
Yeah, and it's amazing when you see everyone shrieking about this stuff. Like you said, you go back and read Pat Buchanan's books, and they're just prophetic. It's exactly what happened. You blow by blow. Same thing, of course, with Paul Gottfried. And really, Sam Francis is one that I delve into in my upcoming book, The Total State. When you look at James Burnham and his managerial revolution, the fact that Sam Francis basically updated that book in Leviathan and its Enemies, and not only updated it, but expanded it in critical ways that, again, made amazing predictions that bear themselves out. You read that book and you look at what happened in 2020, it's a one-to-one. You feel like you've got a decoder ring for the future when you read
100%.
that book. And these people, these intellectual titans who predicted all of this stuff, knew exactly what was going to happen, got pushed out. And who do they get pushed out in favor of? Guys with disastrous policies that have
Crystal, Podhoretz, the architects of the Iraq invasion. I mean, none of these guys, Wolfowitz, if you want to go back to the Bush administration, Dick Cheney, if you want to, and certainly Dick Cheney's daughter, if you want to look at like the kinds of leaders that the American conservative movement has been celebrating until recently, none of these guys have any accomplishments to speak of. None of these guys have ever done anything for us. All of these people have just kind of made things worse. Not kind of, have deliberately made things worse. And I think this is one of the kind of delicate issues, and this would require a whole nother segment, but I think there's a real contempt for the conservative base by a lot of the people in the GOP and a lot of the people even within some of the ranks of the conservative movement. A lot of these people, I think, got to where they are because of where they grew up or where they ran for office, but they don't want to be on the right. They're embarrassed by the people they have to go to for support. They want to be part of the inner party. They want to be part of the Democrats. They want to be part of the media establishment. They don't want to be kissing up to these grassroots conservatives. And they don't like these people. And I think they almost get off when they see these people dispossessed and hurt. And more than anything, the kind of incoherent id behind the Trump revolution is really, we want a political movement that comes out of us and fights for our interests and isn't ashamed of it. And I think every group in a democracy has the right to expect that. The American right is tired of being led down false paths by false prophets and being destroyed on purpose. And it's time that we have leaders who actually are part of us and want to do the right thing by us. If you look at Sam Francis, particularly, if we want to, the concept that has gone absolutely mainstream, it's the concept of anarcho-tyranny, which is something you would have gotten blank stares from everybody even 5 years ago. Now just about everybody talks about that. And people say, the purpose of a system is what it does. It's about who, it's not about what. The law being an arbitrary thing, people just laughing when the media says something like experts warn about disinformation, and everybody just immediately says like, oh, they're lying again. This kind of contempt and distrust of leading institutions, it's a bad sign in one way because it shows how American opinion is fragmenting and these institutions have sort of lost the mandate of heaven. But I think it's a good thing and a necessary thing because there has to be this kind of cynicism toward people who have been misleading you this whole time if you're going to recapture the idealism and the sincerity of a political movement that actually fights for you.
Yeah, and that's why you see, I think, so many, again, mainstream conservatives panicking. Oh, we need someone, we need to be respectable again. We need to have, come on, guys, be serious.
Yeah, respectable to who? I mean, that's the question that's never answered. Like,
well, and the description of we need to do serious politics, as if serious politics has gotten you anywhere in the last several decades. The very people who have failed you at every turn are explaining how, once again, they're the real adults in the room and they're the ones that can lead you to victory. They just haven't happened to do that for the last several decades. They just keep picking these failing policies just randomly out of a hat, I guess. And like you said, I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that many of these people are just second-rate elites. They're elites that didn't get to sit down at the cool kid table. And like you said, they're very angry that now they have to govern the chuds instead of being able to govern the blue state people. And they would love to go ahead and just switch you out for a voter base that the New York Times would praise, And
right. I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the worst Republicans come out of the deep red states. I mean, you saw Lankford, who was out of Oklahoma, who was trying to push that immigration amnesty. Murkowski out of Alaska, Senator Murkowski, who's talking about switching parties now. Of course, Cheney out of Wyoming. And all of these people, I think, that are truly embarrassed and not a little bit hateful toward their own constituents because they don't want to be liked by these people. They want to be liked by the New York Times. That's what they've wanted all along, but they were stuck living here and they were stuck running in these areas. And now they are forced to represent people that they have no truck with and don't really consider themselves a part of. The American right really lacks fundamental representation. I mean, it's very hard to think of a certain person who represents you, who is a fighter for you, whereas just about every other group in America, no matter how marginal, can think of a whole list of champions that are saluted by the media and who they turn to every time there's a controversy. And I think that explains why Donald Trump has this remarkable hold on the Republican base, even though, as many of us would say, he may not even deserve it. Certainly, if we think of what happened with free speech, most of this happened when Donald Trump was in office. The Department of Homeland Security started targeting certain groups for being shut down while Donald Trump was president. Donald Trump was hosting symposiums on internet free speech, but he didn't actually do anything. And eventually it ended with he himself being deplatformed. So a lot of people are skeptical about whether he has the follow through. But then again, you look at the alternatives and they say, well, for better or worse, we have to ride or die with Trump because there's nobody else. And a lot of people keep thinking, like, can we have Trumpism without Trump? What is the future of the GOP after Trump? But I think that it sort of gets the question backwards. The question is, why did people rally to Trump and why do they continue to rally to Trump despite everything? And I think it's because despite the way he talks, despite the fact that he exaggerates and the way he stretches the truth sometimes, at the root, people know he's sincere and a fighter. And he does seem to actually care about the people that he's representing. And that is so unique on the American right because they've just been taken advantage of for so long. And I think half of America is crying out for a champion. And it's very tiresome to hear the conservative movement lecture on, like, well, this is why you're not allowed to do it, because our principles forbid us from pursuing our interests.
I've had the discussion so many times because you're right. I don't think that Donald Trump probably is worthy of the movement that he is in possession of. I don't even know that he has the ability or the follow through, as you said. But what I've tried to explain to so many people as they whinge on about the problems is it doesn't matter because Donald Trump spoke to American identity in a way that no one had in generations. And you
Right.
simply can't hand that off to somebody who's got a slightly better suit and is a little better, a little more polished in talking points. There's an air of that. There's a leadership. There's a quality that's connected to that you simply can't transfer. You can't put on a spreadsheet, and that's something that is so hard for even good, I think, well-meaning conservatives who really want to win, but can't grasp why, like, just being a slightly better implementation of policy is not the key
Right,
for
right.
victory.
The
And
mystery of charisma it's a strange thing. It's not something that you can just get through talking points. And again, if people wanted somebody who classically educated and sprinkles his speech with aphorisms and lessons from history and has a long proven record within the conservative movement, and we know he's a true conservative and will stand with everybody and is also a committed Christian and will do all these things. Well, we had that guy, and his name was Pat Buchanan. And the
right.
conservative movement plunged the knife into his back with utter glee. So now we have Trump.
Well, I think that, like I said, what happened with VDARE is terrible. I know I've seen a couple other outlets talking about this. I hope more people do. I think it's critical. Like I said, people can have their disagreements, they can have their opinions, but if no one can read the opinions, then it doesn't matter. That this is a free speech issue. This is a First Amendment issue. People should have learned their lessons with people like Alex Jones, and they should apply those lessons to publications like VDARE to understand what's going on and the fight that needs to happen there. Obviously, people might have trouble reading the website. Where can they find your work at this point?
Well, I'm on Twitter, or X, I should say, as VDARE James K. I've got the James Polk avatar. VDARE.com is still up for now. I've got a book called Conservatism Inc. Battle for the American Right, which is still available on Amazon. And I just want to say, it's not a question about whether you agree with VDARE or Peter Brimlow or any of the figures that we've talked about. Everybody right of center has a stake in this battle because they are coming for everybody. And we've been seeing this happen for years now. The way that essential services like financial services are being deplatformed, are being taken away from people for doing things that were absolutely taken for granted even 6 years ago. And it's the nature of the left that they have to keep expanding the list of quote unquote hateful or unapproved activities. So if this isn't stopped now, you better believe it's going to come for those things that you may even consider to be respectable. They will come for you too. And so we have to stand together on free speech, or most assuredly we will hang separately.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we're going to pivot over to the questions of the people here. We have Patrick Casey says, didn't recognize James without the motorcycle jacket. Great discussion.
Yeah, me wearing a tie, very unique.
I didn't know. Are you like? Is that like Moldbug? Do you have like a motorcycle?
It's a long story.
Okay.
Generally not a suit and tie guy,
but Cherub Cow says, Patrick, top 3 books on your mind at the moment.
I promise I'm not kissing up to you, but actually your upcoming book is one of the ones that I want to read the most when it comes out. I'm actually going through another deep dive into James Burnham right now with the Machiavellians. And because I'm working on a book of my own, and I'm working on Leviathan again, which is something I try to approach every 2-3 years. I mean, it's a big book.
Oh, yeah.
The thing about Leviathan, too, is Sam Francis. I've got all of Sam Francis's writings. Unfortunately, I never got to meet him before he died, but Leviathan is seen as being sort of incomplete. I mean, it was found basically on an old computer, and then they decided to publish it. And so we don't know if this was sort of his grand unified theory where he unites some of the identity politics things he was writing about with his insights on Burnham. But it's the closest thing that we have. And so it's the closest thing we have to a grand unified theory of how politics works for the American right now. And he is unpopular in some quarters because, and I think you'd agree with me on this, is he, as was James Burnham, was a modernist. He doesn't look to supernatural explanations. He doesn't trust in faith. He sees everything as very concrete and cynical and worldly. I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction between embracing faith and understanding that we also live in a fallen world, and politics is perhaps the most fallen industry of all, and people are going to operate in this way. And if you're going to win in the political sphere, you have to understand how fallen people act, not imagine that they act as you hope they would act.
Yeah, interestingly, that manuscript, like you said, I think is unedited, and you can tell when you
Yeah,
read
100%.
Leviathan because he repeats himself several times. That book would probably be at least 100 pages shorter
Oh yeah,
with
100%. And
a
I'm
good
sure there was a
editor.
lot more
Yeah.
stuff that he would have been brought in. And Sam Francis's writings are just about everywhere. But I mean, you can see how pithy and concise he normally was with his columns. And obviously, Leviathan is a very different style of writing.
And he is like you said, very materialist and modernist.
Hmm.
Interestingly enough, the kind of the debate running between me and my buddy Nima Parvini mirrors the one between Gottfried and Sam Francis about
Right.
kind of the motivations of the ruling elite. And so I think there is a way you can apply Italian elite theory, without even if you're someone who has a belief in the supernatural, who does, if you are a person of faith. I don't think it's exclusive just because Sam Francis and Burnham do tend to fall on that side, that you can't apply those lessons. But either way, it's a critical stepping stone in understanding what's happening right now. And I think not everyone's going to read that book just because it's a massive tome, and relatively technical. But I think more people who are on the right and trying to explore those
Yeah.
ideas need to do so because
I
it's a
would
critical bridge.
I would mention, since you mentioned Gottfried, for a third book that's actually in print is Paul Gottfried's Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt,
Yep.
which gets into the moral motivations for a lot of what the left is doing. I read that when I was in college, 20 some odd years ago. And that's another one where everything that he says seems more and more true by the day. Because at the time, a lot of the things he talked about were very marginal, the kind of things you would only see on a college campus, and now they're everywhere.
And Glow in the Dark says principle that guarantees defeat is a crutch. I'll say this because a lot of people will frame it this way. They'll say, "Oh, well, if you're trying to fight to win, you don't have principles." That's terrible. Okay, that's an attitude that's been handed to you by your enemy. You absolutely should have principles, but you should make sure that they're your principles. They're not a terrible frame that's been handed to you by someone who wants to make sure that you're not a threat to their power. If you notice that every one of your principles is I'm not allowed to have power, and every one of those
Right.
principles is we're
That's
allowed to have
exactly right.
power, you should probably think about where those principles came from because they probably didn't come from people who were looking out for you.
And especially when the people on your side are saying things like, well, we're not allowed to pursue power because it's actually evil to pursue power in this world, or limited government says we shouldn't even run for office or care about the state, what the state does. Frankly, I just don't believe you. I think you're saying that because it's in your interest for people not to do things. And this applies to everybody. Whenever somebody tells you something, you should always ask yourself, how does this person benefit if I believe what he's telling me? And certainly when you have people on the right saying things like, well, you shouldn't listen to these people because our principle is that we should remain where we are and be happy. Frankly, it may be something as cynical as, if we remain out of power, then you can keep giving me money so I can tell you how bad things are and how they'll never get any better, because some people make an industry out of just doing that.
Very true. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate everybody coming by. Obviously, you should make sure to check out James and his work. And of course, if it's your first time on this YouTube channel, you should go ahead and subscribe. You can go ahead and make sure to turn on your notifications, click the bell, everything you need to do to catch these streams live. And if you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. When you do, leave a rating and review. It really helps with the algorithm. And of course, you should also take James' suggestion and go ahead and pre-order my book, The Total State. You can do that on Amazon and everywhere else. All right, guys, thank you so much. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.